What's going on, everyone? Hope you're enjoying your day, night, or whatever time that you're watching this. And you know, have you ever been working on a project and then all of a sudden just one small change ruined everything and you pretty well have to start over? Because that's what just happened to me. And to be more clear, I just watched the dev stream of where they're saying that they're killing self-damage. So while this video was based around fun builds that you can do with the Kuva Bramma, a lot of it was dependent on mitigating the self-damage. Well, that's no longer the case. So I'm having to redo most of this video. Fun times. And while we're on the topic of getting rid of self-damage, let's go ahead and memorialize it one last time. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, I can talk a little bit more about the Kuva Bramma, and specifically this video. I'm wanting to do a video series of fun builds and the more interesting things that you can do with elements of Warframe, rather than just trying to get the most optimized, dry way of playing. Because we have so much power, it's not needed. And you know, if you might find that a little bit interesting, why don't you go ahead and subscribe, like this video, share it out. Just be warned, I do cover other topics besides just Warframe. Now, for this video, I'm going to be covering the basics of how to build, how to get all the stuff that you need, as well as some setups with some synergies with some frames that I think will do really well with the new changes, and just of how the Bramma works. And with that, let's get to it. Alright, first things first, you gotta get it. So, you acquire this weapon by getting it from a lich. Easiest way to do that is go to Sidna, choose the extermination mission, and the larvaling will appear at around 50 to 60 enemies. Kill it. If it doesn't have it, just abort the mission, rinse and repeat until you get the Bramma. Proceed to vanquish your lich, and there you go. You have the Bramma. Now what? Okay, a lot of the tips that I can give you for this weapon has been kind of voided out by the changes that are being made to explosive weapons. A lot of it is just how to avoid the self-damage, and that's not useful anymore. What I will say is that this weapon delivers damage into two stages. The first one is the initial shot and an explosion, but then you have a cluster bomb effect, and this I really do find very useful against very tanky enemies, because it seems to be that the math works out to where a bunch of smaller shots that still will do significant damage, even if they are cut down, will do more aggregate damage than just one big shot. I haven't really sat down to do the math, but it does seem like that's what it feels like. So this weapon does decently well against Sentients, Noxes, and Kuva Liches, mainly because you don't have to keep hitting them over and over or in a specific spot, because they just keep doing so many hits per shot. Now, as I say this, I don't intend to use this in endurance runs because, well, damage is just going to start to fall off no matter what in endurance runs, so take that as it is. One last tip, you don't need to aim with this weapon. As long as you're pretty close, most of the damage is going to hit, which is why I use heavy caliber on it, though I do keep it only at half, which is something which I normally do. I have a full version of it and a half because sometimes you don't want to take away too much accuracy. Now, this segues into how I build this thing. And the build I'm using is pretty straightforward. It's essentially a hybrid build that focuses on one element, which is corrosion, since that's what's best for an all-purpose build here. And I also got my progenerator to be a toxic, specifically sarin, because, well, fastest way to kill things. But you can also choose to have it as electric. I'll have the mods that I'm using for this build up on the screen, but to go into a little bit more detail in what I'm doing here, I'm basically using the dual status mods to create the element that I want, then pumping that damage even further with using the regular elemental damage mods, and just using point strike to bump up the critical chance to a decent amount. The heavy caliber I'm using is really optional, and that's where you're going to place in your ribbon if you have one, or any other mods that you desire. Just be warned that if you do this, you're going to need a total of 3 forma. The build I'm using is only using 2. Now let's move on to the next part of this video, which is what you probably clicked on it for, and that's the setups and the synergies and whatnot that you can do with this weapon. And with the removal of self-damage, a lot of things open up with what you can do with this weapon that wouldn't have worked out as well otherwise. Now, I'm not going over every single possible synergy that this weapon can have with certain warframes, since I've built this entire ecosystem around fighting the Grineer as well as the Corrupted. So if you know about a good synergy and you want to share it, just put it down in the comments below. First up is Vauban, and well, this guy is also getting a nice buff since they're adding in shield gating. And this guy really needed it since he had no built-in survivability or any real damage in his kit, which the Bramma kinda makes up for. And Vauban is really made for the Bramma since he can cluster together a bunch of enemies, almost all of them if you play it right, and make the Bramma super effective. Because the more enemies you can hit with the clusters, the more effective the weapon is. Now, to get the most out of your vortex use, you want to use it in an open area of where you can drag as many enemies as you can. If you use it in corridors or tight spaces, they'll just get stuck, and well, there isn't much of a point to use it to just shoot off your explosive arrow. The build for him is pretty simple. You really just go with max range, or as much range that you can pump into your build as possible. Efficiency and duration is kinda nice. You don't need strength, since all of your damage is going to be coming from your weapon. Now, I also throw in some survivability with Prime Vigor and Adaptation. If you don't have these mods, just put in your basic shield and health mods. There is also one other thing that I want to talk about real quick before I move on to the next setup, and that is Nidus, because he has a very similar ability that you can just cluster enemies together. And he was on this list mainly because he could just not care about self-damage, but because they removed that, the weapon more gets in the way of his kit than Vauban's. So you can use Nidus, but Vauban is a little bit more fun because you're not fighting with Nidus's kit as much. So next up is Atlas, and this guy's pretty fun by himself and doesn't really need the Bramma, but there's still the synergy possibly from him not being able to be knocked back. I'm not too sure if this is going to be a thing, but there's still a chance. And while his kit doesn't necessarily synergize well with the Bramma, it also doesn't really interfere with it either. This is more for those people that don't like getting knocked back or staggered, so. And this video theme is more about fun builds rather than the most optimized. The build I'm using for this is an Umbra build, so it's a pretty in-game level build, so you might not get all the parts, but quintessentially just get the normal versions if you don't have the Umbra mods. But by the time you can really get the Bramma, you should be able to get these. Also, if it does turn out that the stagger is still forced even though Atlas shouldn't be staggered, I'll leave a pinned comment down in the comment sections to tell you. We're moving on to Equinox, the Warframe that specializes in doing everything. And the build that we're specifically going with this time is focused around the Duality mod, more or less the 300 buff clone. And this is also where I'm going to have to stop and just talk about how trash the Warframe AI is, because the clone will get stuck or just left behind if you have to go through a map. So this build does best if you are stationary or in like a mobile defense. However, I would very much recommend that you use Wukong instead if you're gonna be very mobile and running in a bunch of different places, because its clone just keeps catching up and it has a much better AI to keep up with you. It kind of really makes me want DE to go back and fix the Equinox clone. And just quickly, if you want to do the Wukong, focus on strength and just overall survivability and you'll do fine. Now back to Equinox. How to set her build up, just go with duration and survivability and throw in a hunter adrenaline because you're going to need a lot of energy. Energy management is a thing with Duality Equinox, at least for me. So my operator school will usually be Xenoric for energy management, but at really high levels, I'll usually take the Vazarin instead, because it just is better to stay alive. Duality Equinox has a very high skill ceiling to play her, which in turn does make her fun to play. The basic gameplay loop is whenever you switch forms, you're gonna be looking for the opportunities to either deal damage or heal yourself up. And in between those two stages, you're gonna be looking for energy management, because you're just gonna be burning through as much energy as possible. Just use the little energy pizzas and you should be fine, or use Xenoric, whichever. So last up is Chroma. And yeah, this guy is gonna need some love after this nerf. But you know, he's still pretty viable and fun. I mean, who wouldn't want to have obscene damage numbers flying up on your screen? And while being a nigh indestructible dragon, you can go with Rhino and get all the same stuff, really. But come on, dragon. Okay, all joking aside, I'm going to just let the gameplay footage kind of do the talking, but this setup is for those that want to push the numbers as far as you can, without the nasty min-maxing. I will say, however, that I personally enjoy a fire chroma, just because it's a little bit more self-contained and I don't have to rely too heavily on Vazarin or Arcane Grace. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did enjoy it, why don't you go ahead and hit the thumbs up and share it out. Anyways, I hope to see you in the next video, and I'm just gonna go crash over there. See ya.